menaxhimi i burimeve njerëzore në kompanitë mediatike, dohet më tepër fokusi i takimit ton të dytë në muajin shkurt, kurse sot kemi më tepër përgjegjësi e gazetarëve në demokraci, le them pjesë e Pare Modulit, por Etosi Profesionale i gazetarëve. Sikur se jeni njohur, kemi të ftuar profesor Thomas Hanitzch, Miniut, është shefi i departamentit të studimeve të medias në Universitetin e Miniut. Pastaj të ftuarit e tjerë nga media kemi Fatos Baxhakun dhe Alfred Lelën, dy gazetarë cilët ju me siguri i njihni që të gjithë më mirë se sa unë pase në njërin prej tyre. Do operojmë në këtë mënyrë, do filloj me referimin e vetë profesor Hanitzch, i cili do të bëj një rezume të një ankete e bërë për etosin profesional të gazetarëve në 21 vende të botës, të cilën ai si projekt do ta prezantoj pak, të cilën ai e ka drejtuar gjithë këto vite. Do vazhdoj unë pastaj me disa të dhëna e të njëjtit projekt që ne kemi qenë dhe pastaj do jenë të ftuarit tanë. Është fjala për ju, Thomas? Also da bist du jetzt an der Reihe.
Well, maybe a few words about myself and the kind of experience that motivated me for becoming a researcher. I was born in the former GDR, which is now East Germany, in the beautiful town of Dresden, and I was 19 when the wall came down, and there was this historical moment when in East Germany there was a very urgent need for young, qualified, devoted, committed people who would like to join the profession of journalism. As you might know or might remember from your own transition in East Germany, in the late 80s and early 90s, East Germany has transitioned from a socialist media system into what is now more the kind of commercial capitalist media system, and which means that many newspapers, radio stations and TV stations from one moment to another needed to get rid of their oldish, contaminated, ideologically contaminated journalists and to get a new breed of young journalists to thrive in the new media era. And that was the moment when I was 19, I became a journalist with no professional background in education whatsoever. This is something that wouldn't be possible in Germany today. So I became a journalist with no experience. I went to the editor-in-chief of a local newspaper with just 3 short stories with me, and I did not really expect this person to have time for me, but he was available, and he said, just come in and get me your 3 stories, and he glanced over them, and he said, okay, let's give it a try. This is your first assignment. So I became a journalist, without the usual professional backgrounds. Over time, I enjoyed working as a journalist, but always I wondered, to what extent is the kind of journalism that we do in East Germany, actually different from journalism in other countries? Is journalism as we do it special, or is it the mainstream, normal kind of way that you would find probably everywhere in the world? And so I started wondering about the journalistic profession in other countries. What could we probably learn from other countries? How could we distinguish ourselves as journalists from journalists in other countries? And then I went back to the university, also in a moment of sort of dissatisfaction with my own personal professional development, because how many of you work for newspapers? Or all of you radio journalists, TV? So in newspapers there's a certain cultural hierarchy, so to speak. I don't know how far it goes in Albania. In Germany it's that way. You start out from the local desk. You work on stories about neighborhoods, about local parliaments, and about local companies, local sports, stuff like this. This is considered to be the low-ranked job in a newspaper in Germany. as you develop professionally, people start to think about yourself, or might start to think about yourself like, well, this is a good guy, we should give him a better opportunity, and then they move you up. Doesn't mean that you become an editor or a senior editor, but you get moved up into a different desk. And the best and the highest regarded desk in the German context is the political desk. So I became, from a local journalist, I became a political journalist, working on political affairs, all about Germany. Now, while I found my job as a local journalist very interesting because I had so many different stories, different people, people I know, I had a relationship with a personal, friendly relationship. I met them in the mayor's house. So that was an area I felt quite comfortable with. Moving to the political desk, I spent most of my time with assorting, reconstructing messages from wire services. So I compiled DPA, AFP, AP messages and compiled them into a news story. That was just boring. So this is why I went back to university. So that was one of the reasons why I left the profession. But I wanted to stick with it, and I became a researcher. And that is probably sort of the biographical background that I have, which made me interested in the different ways people, journalists, go about their profession in different countries. And as a researcher, just like a journalist, at least in the German context, you've got a lot of freedom. I'm free to choose the things I would like to work on. Journalists, many journalists also have this freedom to decide about the stories they would like to work on. So I started to get interested in different journalisms around the world. And once I had the opportunity to carry out such a study, I grabbed it and I teamed up with researchers from various countries to produce a story about differences in journalism in various countries. So this is sort of the end of the story, of the first story. That was a large survey, a large investigation that involved 2,100 journalists from 21 countries. But now we are about to repeat the same study, this time with about 80 countries. I was glad that Jonila was involved. She contributed Albania to the, which is now called the Worlds of Journalism study, in order to compare Albanian journalism with other kinds of journalism. And what I found particularly interesting was to do a sort of a regional comparison. Well, what did we do? Well, over time I noticed that also in terms of the language that I speak, I'm now much more a researcher than a journalist, so I hope you understand that sometimes my language is not really very journalistic anymore. But I tried to stick to my former journalist language as much as I can. I still do remember. This study was about trying to get our heads around differences in journalistic cultures around the world. And this is why we conducted extensive interviews with journalists in all of these 21 countries. These countries are as diverse as Australia, Brazil, Chile, China, Egypt, Russia, Indonesia, Israel, Mexico, United States, Uganda, many more. The idea was to have a picture from very different countries to actually know how universal our professional values actually are. And so we did collect data in each of these countries. We did interviews with 100 assorted journalists. There was a sampling strategy that was exactly the same for each and every country. We also compiled data about the news organizations for which the journalists work, because we know that the organization has a strong influence on the way journalists work. And we also compiled data on the nations, on the societies, because it makes a difference if you work as a journalist in China or in Germany or in Russia. There are different political constraints, there are different economic frameworks. this is the sample. I just don't want to go too much into detail about this. Today, I would like to talk about 3 central issues that we investigated in that study. One is, how do journalists reflect on their own role and positioning in society? What do they think does journalism as a profession stand for? What is journalism supposed to deliver to society? So what is it about? What is it about to be a journalist? This is one issue. The second issue is, to what extent is journalism influenced by external constraints? Political, economic, professional, many others. And also the question, how much autonomy do journalists actually enjoy in different countries? And the third issue is concerned with the journalists' trust in public institutions, which is an interesting issue on its own right, because you might know that there is this idea that people have over time developed less trust in governments and less trust in politics. This is something that we can observe in the Western world for many, many years. The trust in institution and the trust in politics is on the decline dramatically. Now, many people, especially politicians, like to connect this problem with the work of the media. So the idea is that the media are often blamed for driving people being cynical about politics, because the media have this tendency to write in negative ways about politicians, about politics. People believe this and develop a negative attitude toward politicians. So the question is, are journalists actually more distrusting in politics than the general audience? Is, I think, an interesting issue. Now, starting with the first thing, the role of journalists in society. And this is actually one of the movies that motivated me to become a journalist. How many of you do know this movie? I mean, you got to know this.
Yes.
Of course, you do. Anyone with a title? All the President's Men. In Germany, it's always translated, so it's a different title, but that's the original American title. It's. I'm sorry.
We say always Watergate and.
Yes, of
like
course,
that,
because it is about
I don't know.
Watergate. Yeah, it's about these 2 relentless journalists. You can see here as actors, it's Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman playing Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who exposed the Watergate scandal for the Washington Post, which was a milestone in the history and culture of American journalism. And it was sort of the breeding ground of the modern idea of investigative journalism. This is, interestingly, if we do have applications for our journalism master in Munich, we ask our potential students, what areas of the media, which kind of media would you like to work for once you graduated? Most of them still say newspapers. And they have these images in mind, people working with papers on the phone, which is, by the way, the telephone is still the most used method of inquiry, despite the internet, which is, I think, it's good news. So, but nevertheless, these were the pictures. You know, you have these relentless journalists exposing the wrongdoings of those in power. Or this, maybe some of you know this movie, was another movie that actually motivated me to contemplate becoming a foreign correspondent. That was the movie called Under Fire from 1989. Nick Nolte playing a foreign correspondent and a photo reporter in, I think, in the starting civil war in Nicaragua, and he was sacrificing his life for a greater good. He shot a few photographs, and these photographs were smuggled out of the country, and he was going to die for the sake of the good outcome of that story. Or recently, one of my favorite TV shows, The Newsroom. If you like American journalism, or if you like what American journalists contemplate about what is good journalism, you should really look this series. It's especially for those who like the actor Jeff Daniels. It's about a commercial American cable news TV station that rediscovers investigative and critical journalism. One of the curiosities in the show, by the way, is that the main actor and the main character, which is playing a leading journalist in the United States, is a Republican criticizing Republicans. So, but these is the kinds of pictures that many of us have in mind when we think about journalism. What I found so interesting is that so many other areas of journalism are not in these public pictures. Think about celebrity coverage, entertainment news in general, lifestyle coverage, sports news, and many other areas which nowadays actually are the most covered areas in journalism. Most journalists do not work in political journalism here. Most journalists work in other fields. So this is why we started to think about how can we actually account for this many different ideas of what is journalism about. Now, we asked the journalists in the interviews many questions. One of the questions was, if you think about yourself, your own work, what do you think are the major roles that you are playing as a journalist in society? And these are essentially the results from the qualitative responses of the journalists. So the bigger the font is, the bigger the writing, the more often these answers came from journalists. And these are actually the usual suspects. It's not quite surprising. Most journalists contemplated about themselves as information providers, as disseminators, somebody who transmits the news from A to B, as gatekeepers, even in the time of the internet, when it's really hard for a journalist to be a gatekeeper, still there is this idea of gatekeepers thriving in the profession. To be a watchdog, to hold the powers to account, to be an interpreter of news, and many other things. And you can see there's some smaller writings saying something like service provider or entertainer. These are not the major ideas that journalists have in mind when they speak about their profession. So still, even though journalism has changed a lot during the last 20 years, I would say, has turned from an essentially political enterprise into a more diversified profession covering many issues, not just political affairs, but many other affairs. Still, you have these ideas in mind when you ask journalists in these many countries that are actually so different. We also ask other questions when we talk to the journalists in order to get an idea of how different journalists actually are. If I go back to this picture again, these are sort of universals. These are the things that most journalists around the world would agree on, and probably you as well. But there are differences, and as comparative researchers, we're mostly interested in getting hold of differences. So, of course, in all research, it starts with some sort of theory. We thought about how can we potentially distinguish different approaches to journalism culturally in different countries. And here we developed three major dimensions that we use in our analysis. One we called interventionism. Interventionism is the idea that, as a journalist, I can do two things, essentially. And in the extreme, I can be a completely neutral reporter, disseminating, transporting the news as it is from A to B. But I could also involve myself in social affairs. If you look at journalists in many Arab countries, you will find this idea very deeply ingrained in the profession. journalists in Egypt, for instance, would always maintain that they are not bystanders. They are not objective in the classic sense. Journalists are members of society, and as such, they have the obligation to involve themselves in social affairs. They have to do something about it. If something is wrong in society, they have to act. But you will not find this attitude very often among Western journalists. If I would talk to my German colleagues, they would say, no, 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 I'm a bystander. I have to be detached. I have to be objective and neutral. So this is a major distinction between different traditions of journalism around the world. Second, power distance. Again, two extremes. High power distance means that there is a large distinction, wide space between powers in society, government, commercial, economic leaders, central ideologies in society. These are power centers, and there's a huge distance to journalists. Yeah? So they are far apart. That's a typical idea of the journalists being sort of the fourth estate, a watchdog, looking at those in power, and if they do something wrong, they write about it. On the other hand, you find another way of dealing with this issue that is often ingrained in the idea of party journalism and or development journalism, which means that if you look at Singapore, for instance, 20, 30 years back, Singapore, these years, has been an underdeveloped society. Now look at Singapore where it is today. Singapore needed to develop itself. The same goes for Malaysia. The same goes for Thailand and the Philippines and Indonesia. These countries needed to develop themselves economically, and the idea was that it's the job of the journalist to help the government to bring about social well-being and prosperity. Of course, this idea was abused by the parties and by those in power to co-opt the journalists and to say, well, prevent them from exposing the wrongdoings of the government. So again, two extremes. One, a loyal kind of opportunist journalism, and the other extreme is the watchdog fourth estate kind of journalism. And the third dimension is market orientation. And that is a dimension that I think cuts across different countries and nations and cultures. Traditionally, if you look back into the 50s or the 60s, the idea was that journalism is a public service. We as journalists doing a public service for our audiences. And this is usually in the realm of politics. We need to educate our audiences in order to have them making informed decisions in politics. If it comes to elections, political elections, people should know about political parties, should know about political ideologies. So we need to politically educate people. This is what the public needs to know in order to act in the political domain. So that was usually the idea of the audience in the capacity of citizens. These days, we often find in journalism the idea of the audience in the capacity as consumers. And as consumers, we have needs different from our activities in the political world. We are consumers, we need to know which car should I buy, what is the best product here and there. So consumer news, you can use news, is something that has become incredibly important in journalism today. And these two orientations you can find in journalism. Now, if you look back at these three dimensions, it's not the idea to say a journalist, or you for that matter, classifies as either or, as minus or plus. It's usually you're somewhere in between the poles. It's a continuum. And the idea of the continuum actually allows us to compare journalists across different countries. This is just for the record. We used statements that we asked the journalists, and they had the opportunity to rate those statements in the extent to which they agree, and this we used for analyzing differences. I don't want to bore you with too many numbers. I show you a picture. As you know, there is this fancy saying that says, a picture says more than 1,000 words, and I found it so interesting that whenever I talk to people in different cultures, almost every culture claims that they have originated this saying. As far as I know, it's originally from China. It went to the US, for instance, where it was used in advertising as a very important metaphor. Now, okay, here we go. I need to explain this, of course. These are the 21 countries that we investigated. And what we did was essentially two things. One, if you just look at the spots, these are, so to speak, the average journalism cultures in Germany, in Austria, in Portugal, Turkey, Egypt, and many other countries. What you can see here is that if you look at the differences and the different ideas about journalism, you can see that the Western countries actually cluster together very nicely, something that we would expect. Of course, Austria, Germany, the US, the United States, they're very close together. There's Switzerland, Australia, Portugal, and Spain. You could say, okay, this is sort of a Western journalism cluster. These journalists are really very similar. But then you can see to the left of this map, you can see a lot of differences. You can see that there's Russia, China, and Pakistan being in close proximity to each other, which indicates that the journalism that is entertained in these countries is to some extent very similar. Also very interesting, if you just look down, Turkey and Egypt, they sort of are special cases, and this, connects with what I said before. In Egypt, journalists have a very strong favor for an active journalism, a journalism that is doing something for society. Now, I showed you the locations of the cases of the countries, and now you can see a lot of arrows here, the red or reddish arrows. These arrows are symbolizing the statements that we asked the journalists. So what it tells us is Turkey here, Turkey and Egypt is very close to this statement, which means it has some proximity to advocating for social change in society, to do with some sort of interventionist journalism. You can see that these countries here on this side of the map to the left, they have some sort of proximity, like here Uganda, to support official policy, a kind of journalism that is supportive of government, which is not surprising because in Uganda you find this idea of development journalism very often. The same is true for Pakistan and many other things. I could talk about this picture forever because it's actually a very fascinating account of how similar and how different journalists are around the world. Just one side note, this is actually my favorite statistical coefficient. It's a coefficient of alienation that sort of remembers me of a memorable quote from Lieutenant Commander Data in Star Trek. So coefficient of alienation means that there's a lot of noise here that we cannot explain. And the value here indicates that there is still a lot of substantive stuff here that we need to further investigate. How do journalism cultures relate to democracy? Here you can see interventionism, so the extent to which journalists are actually willing to intervene in society. And here you can see scores of democracy. These here, the democracy score that is used by the EIU that is the Economist Intelligence Unit that is attached to the Economist Monthly, is the more you go to the right, the better the score in democracy. And you can see that there is a clear connection between interventionism and democracy. You find more intervention in societies that are less democratic, which makes sense because journalists in these societies might have the feeling that they have to do something about society. They have to do something about the wrongdoings of their government. Economy, also, strong connection between interventionism and economy. You can see that in the countries that are economically well off, here you find not much interventionism because people feel very much satisfied with the economic performance of their societies. But in these societies, these are most poor societies, there's a lot of intervention in journalism. What is the consequence of this? One, this is also an issue that researchers could speculate and talk about endlessly. A Westerner or a person like me who has grown up in the West and has learned the profession according to the standards that we have in the Western world might look at journalism as being done in non-Western countries and with a clearly clouded lens, so to speak, because the kinds of standards that we have, they do work well in Germany, not necessarily so in non-Western countries. Does it mean that a journalist who is interventionist, a journalist who is not objective but who takes side in a political discourse, is this journalist less professional? In a Western understanding, we would say this is not very professional for a journalist to be interventionist, to take sides, to be biased. But in some countries, like in Egypt for instance, it is actually professional to be biased. It's professional to say where I stand as a journalist. And this is, I think, it's a very important message that professional or professionalism is relative to the kinds of norms and circumstances of society. Okay, talking about trust. Because I just lately got very interested in the trust issue. And I anchored this already. The idea that the media drive people less trusting is an actually very interesting one. Now, this is why we also ask journalists in these 21 societies, we ask them, to what extent do you trust in the parliament, in the government, in political parties, and in politicians in general, politicians as persons? So, okay, this is only the Western countries. You can see there is a very clear picture. People have a lot of trust in the parliament. Oh, I should explain the scale. The scale was no trust is 1, and full trust is 5. So you can see there's no country with full trust. This is why I cut the scale here in 4. So the middle would be 3. 3 means more or less no opinion, so to speak. Not trusting, but also not distrusting. But you can generally see that most of the countries in the West, journalists have very little trust in politics. True. They have most trust in the parliament and in the government, but they have little trust in political parties. And they have little trust in politicians. Isn't it interesting that people have little trust in politicians, but they have more trust in the parliament and the government, bodies that are essentially made of politicians? But this is one of the interesting contradictions in many of this trust research. Even if you ask people, to what extent do they trust journalists or the media? I have done this in Germany, and it turned out that people have lots of trust in the media, but they have no trust in journalists. So, now you can see here in the West the picture is like this, and we can repeat essentially the structure for non-Western countries. And here you can see journalists have even less trust in the Western world than in the Western world, which makes a lot of sense. But the interesting question is, are journalists actually less trusting than the general publics? And now I have to bother you with numbers, but I explain it shortly. Just look at this column. This column says something about the difference in journalists trusting more or less than their audiences. If this number is positive, then it means journalists have actually more trust than their audiences. If it is negative, it means journalists are less trusting than their audiences. And if it's close to zero, like here in the case of the US, or Switzerland, or Spain, or Australia, and here, down there, it means it's essentially the same. Journalists and the general audiences have the same level of trust in politics. Interestingly, journalists in Western countries, in all for which we have data, journalists are either more trusting than the general audience, or there are no differences. In the non-Western world, we find many countries in which journalists are actually less trusting than the general audience. And why is that? Probably because if you look at China, for instance, this is one, or if you look at Indonesia or Turkey, as a journalist, you often know about things that go wrong in the government. You know about corruption. You know about wrongdoings of the party, but you're not always entitled to report on it. So journalists know, they are less trusting, but the public doesn't get to know, and so they're probably more trusting. And that would be one explanation. But the pattern that we find is that in many developing countries, journalists indeed have less trust than the general audience, but they don't pass this distrust on their audiences. So it's actually not so much the journalists who generate distrust among the audiences. It is the political circumstances. It's the performance of the government. It's the performance of regional leaders. And so the primary explanation why audiences have little trust in their political leaders in many countries is because the politicians just don't perform very well, and we can prove this empirically. I leave it here. Thank you very much for your attention and being so kind with me and giving me your attention. Although this whole stuff is very much science and not so much journalism, but I hope you can take away something with you from here. So, thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion.